Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. We really do appreciate it. I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. You can find him and his wife on nativestorytellers.com. It's an amazing website. It deals with the native storytelling tradition and how they preserved their cosmology, their history, their antiquity in stories that have been passed down through generations. Perhaps a better way of preserving history than the history books like we use today that are really out of date. But that's for another time. We have Gary Wayne tonight on. I'm so excited about this interview, I can't tell you. He is the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. He joins us tonight to enlighten us about the Watchers. Who were they as it pertains to the Bible, polytheist accounts, and it relates to the aliens in the New Age at the end time. He is a Christian contrarian who has maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Holy Bible and Gnostic scriptures, the Qur'an, and the and the Gita. My tongue won't do that one. Gilgamesh and the other ancient epics, language and etymology, and the Secret Society publications. He's an amazing guest. He is so knowledgeable. It just is amazing. And every time we have him on, not only do I have notes all over the place, but I want to make sure that I get his information out of him because he's encyclopedic as far as his knowledge and his wisdom, and he is so generous in how he shares it. I do have a lot of questions tonight, so let's welcome Gary to the show. Gary, I'm so glad you're here tonight.
Well, so happy to be back again with you tonight, Barbara, and very much looking forward to the conversation, and hopefully we'll shed some light on some areas, again, that people have some questions about.
Well, the term Watchers has been thrown around like crazy to the point that I don't think people really understand, biblically speaking, who the Watchers were, what their purpose was, how they messed up, and why. So if we can cover that in 2 hours, I'll be happy.
And there's so many different branches that were this sort of heads, and, it's not just, a term that is reserved for, the book of Enoch. So as we dive into this, I think people will be quite surprised at some of the common denominators from so many sources that have a similar kind of parallel directional narrative about both in prehistory and a lot even as we get towards the future.
Okay, so first of all, who were they? Now, and I want to do step back just a little bit because in the metaphysical community, there seem to have been, I don't know, fads, crazes, whatever you want to call them, where people were light workers or light bearers, or and now a lot of the terminology that is being put out there is, I am a direct descendant of the Watchers, which I mean, who knows? You know, the genealogies don't go quite that far back, but it's another one of those little catchphrases, and people don't know who they were and what their purpose was. So let's go back to who were they.
Yeah, and I'll just underscore what you're talking about in terms of people, particularly today, as we are, getting more information on genealogies and DNA and blood types, that so many people are trying to find a way or have kept records throughout the millennia and generations of these genealogies. This is a pretty common habit of particularly royal families of keeping those genealogies that also take their bloodlines back to the giants and their parents, the angels, which are commonly known in the book of Enoch as watchers, or those who, watch and guard the throne. And there was 3 of those groups of angels. There was as Enoch talks about them, the cherubim, which most people are familiar with, the cherubim that are on the Ark of the Covenant and have these big wings that cover and surround the throne of God. You have the Ophanim, which isn't a word that shows up in the English translations of the Bible, but when you look at the throne that God is traveling on in Ezekiel, where you have wheels within wheels, and the cherubim are above the wheels, they're beside the wheels, but they're never really inside the wheels. And the wheel goes back to the word Ophan, and I am is the male plural, just as you add that onto cherubim or seraphim or Nephilim or whatever. And so what Enoch seems to be saying is that this is a third set that is almost like a subset of the cherubim, because they have one face that's different in the 4 faces that they have, but they're also mixed in with this grouping of the wheels that apparently the throne of God comes into the physical world on and are around the throne. And then you have the seraphim watchers. So you got 3 groups, and they're all called those who watch and those who guard in the book of Enoch. So as we take that back from where most people understand the term watchers, those would be very high-level orders of angels, with the seraphim angels, the fiery serpent angels, as they're described in Isaiah 6. As you take seraphim back to Hebrew, it is a fiery serpent-faced angel that ministers amongst the fiery stones before the throne. They have 6 wings, and they're also commonly understood as kind of a dragon, because a serpent with wings is known as a dragon, as in, let's say, a plumed serpent, as in Quetzalcoatl and other gods of Central and South America and North America as plumed or feathered serpent gods, and or Naga gods around the world. So kind of a similar type of being that is in most cultures. And these are the watchers that are the ones who create the giants in the book of Enoch, and are thought to be the same watchers that are in the Bible. And in the Bible, we don't get many references to the term watchers, just 3 times in Daniel 4, where these angels dealing with government are coming from the throne of God and delivering messages of government. And they're thought to be the seraphim watchers, just as the sons of God in Genesis 6 are thought to be the seraphim watchers, as they're described in First Enoch, who are the ones who go to human females first, at least. And I think there was more incursions after that. But the ones who go to Mount Hermon, as it's recorded in Enoch, those are the watcher seraphim angels that produce the first set of giants.
Okay, so knowing that God is an etheric being, not necessarily of human form, are the angels etheric, or they have taken on a human form or a physical form of some sort in order to communicate with the earthly creatures, right?
I think they can communicate with earthly creatures from a different dimension as a spirit being, and all beings in heaven are spirit beings. But if they want to interact with the world, then and be sort of seen as physical, then they have to take a physical form in the physical universe, and which again would be, I think, a different dimension than what the spirit realm or the heavenly realm is. And we get sort of a hint of that in Jude 1:6, where it says these angels that are describing the sins of the angels in Genesis 6 before the flood for creating the giants. They left their habitation, and habitation goes back to a Greek word which means oikoterion, or it doesn't mean, it is the word oikoterion, and it means a dwelling place for the spirit, just as in 2 Corinthians 2:5, it's talking about this place, this house in heaven, which is also oikoterion, that is where your spirit wants to be part of. So I think what it's talking about here is that you need also a dwelling place for a spirit in the physical universe to interact. And so they have to create this physical nature and of choice, and I think of gender of choice too. If you're going to create a complete physical nature in the physical world, you can choose what you want to look like. I also think this is why demons, for example, as Jesus describes them, they are like thirsting for a body, and they're in dry places while they're trying to find a body to possess, and they want to possess that body so that they can actually interact with the world, except that it's not a symbiotic relationship. So it's very much a hostile takeover, as opposed to, let's say an avatar effect, which seems to be more of a symbiotic relationship that Satan and other angels in other religions, Satan in the Bible, and let's say, gods like Vishnu in the Indian religion would avatar a body and would be more of a symbiotic relationship. But the point of the matter here is that they need to be able to interact. But once you take a physical body, then you become subject to the laws of the physical world and all of the temptations and all of the I guess, feelings and desires and everything that affects humankind would affect an angelic being or a godlike being taking a physical form in the physical world. And I think we see that portrayed in the depiction of these gods in so many accounts, whether they're demigods or actual gods or lower gods as opposed to parent gods, that they seem to have a lot of similar sort of weaknesses and fallacies, just like humankind had, or imperfections. And I want to underline this in terms of connecting a couple dots in terms of these watchers who would have taken this physical form to interact with the world. If you look at that word watcher and you take that back into Greek, you go back to the word drakonta, which translates to watch. And it's the same sort of idea that the seraphim watchers were watchers and were overseeing and governing this world, just as you get that same sort of term in other sort of mythos like the alien mythos, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a while. And it is also understood that when you look at the Neteru gods or the Abdu gods or the Sabeti gods of Egypt, that essentially all roots back to the same, and they're the same gods, just different names for the same parent gods over in Egypt, but that goes back to watch, as the Urshu gods are the watcher gods. And so this is a common understanding in prehistory about these watchers, whether or not you think they're gods, whether or not you think they're angels, whether or not you think they're aliens or whatnot. They have this common sort of name and this common sort of description, just as you get these archons and seraphim-like angels who are serpent-like, that are part of the ruling class led by Ialta-Boath, which we would know in Christianity as Satan.
Now, what confuses me is, well, are one of the attributes that they have in human form that they can take on any size or dimension that they want to? In other words, sometimes they appear as giants.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes,
sometimes
they can seemingly do that. Yeah.
They seem in human dimension, and then other times they appear as giants, and sometimes you don't even see them at all. You just hear them.
Yeah. So again, whether or not they take a physical form or a spiritual form in this world, they can come in either way. But seemingly, and even in the Bible, I mean, we're told that they're giant shining beings. We're told that they are, six-winged and several different types of wings in the, 4 wings and 2-winged angels. You've got ones that are just look like men, like in the Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham narratives. There's ones that look like men that they don't know they're angels, and there's ones where they do know they're angels and signified some way or another. You've got Satan, who is described as a serpent and a dragon, also as a cherubim, so he's a little bit unique in terms of his descriptions, but again, different forms, different shapes, and certainly we see in accounts in a lot of Gnostic religions and the Christian religion where Satan comes in different forms, again, sort of showing that changeling quality that these beings from another realm have.
Okay, so we're all watchers. Did all watchers become fallen angels, or did some of them not fall?
I would say some of them rebelled. We don't know how many of the watchers rebelled, and I would say watchers from all groups would have rebelled. I would also say that there are many other orders who also rebelled. That would be some of the lower orders. And we don't know how many angels were actually created. We get an indication in the New Testament where, you get some accounts where it says they're uncountable, but in Revelation it says 10,000 times 10,000, which is 100 million. And certainly by Revelation 12, a third of them would have rebelled. So that means there would have been at least, whether or not they did all at once, but certainly by the midpoint of the last 7 years of the end time, at least 33 million will have rebelled. And who knows if that number is greater because of the other sort of descriptions of the numbers. So I would say that we had them rebel from all different orders. And just as we get different looking Nephilim described around the world as demigods by the many different names that they're known. So, not only do you get gods that have sort of this raven sort of look like the Anunnaki have, even though there's a lot of serpent gods and reptilian gods in the Sumerian pantheon, you also get these raven gods, and they're also known as Tengu in Southeast Asia. You get these ones that are all producing offspring as well as the serpent ones, just as you get serpent kings all around the world as the offspring of the serpent seraphim Nephilim. You also get an order of the Tengu, and typically they produce a warrior class of bird type being and a priest class, which again is similar to the serpent type of offspring, let's say like the Nagas, where they created a warrior ruling class, and also the Brahmin class of priests that ruled subcontinent of India. You also see offspring in Egypt of gods like Horus and some of the bird-like Ogdod gods, and again descriptions of these offspring of these beings. And you also get the Xibalba out of the Kisha Maya, which are also offspring of the gods, and they're kind of like pretty much a sort of owl or raven type look, and also a minor sect of Xibalba. I think if I remember the name is Comatotes or something like. I'll have to think about that one, but that's where the Batman image comes from. That. Has obviously got that sort of bird-like look. And then you've got all of these gods that have this sort of lion look. And, whether or not it is, a god like Sektek in Egypt, or many of the other lion named gods out of Egypt mythology, they also created offspring. And we get all of these accounts of the lion-like men, even in the Bible, of Moab and Gad, and these lion warrior type beings that are all throughout Sumerian, religions and legends as well. So I think there was many kinds that rebelled, and many of them had offspring. So when we get coming out of prehistory, all of these different types of beings, one wonders. And again, you also have like Anubis and dog or hyena or wolf-like gods that also tend to seem to have created offspring like them as well. And the Sinophalia and the dogmen mythos, as that sort of goes.
Well, originally though, they weren't supposed to come into contact with us. They were just supposed to watch. And
yeah,
they
that
decided
seems to be the case. Is that they were there to watch, and that the earth was separated into the number of nations according to the Bible as the number of the sons of Jacob born in Egypt, which is 70. So the descendants of Adam, as it says in the Bible, were divided amongst the watchers into 70 groups, just as you have 70 nations again after the flood. That we would presume that the angels, the rebellious angels who didn't go to the abyss, would be ruling over, would be reassigned and replacing the ones that went to the abyss for their crimes before the flood, and rule the world afterwards, all reporting to Satan in sort of that hierarchy. But yeah, they would have ruled over those different realms or dominions of the earth, and had a governmental structure that would go down and split that up within those 70 different nations.
But that's after
we don't
the
really
flood.
get that told in prehistory. It's more like anywhere from 4 to 9 antediluvian civilizations. But again, that could have been part of how that whole hierarchical structure was split amongst the gods.
But before the flood, were the watchers?
Yeah, both before and after.
Oh, okay. So they did come in contact with humanity.
Yes, and I think they were there just there to watch and to help. But then they provide knowledge. They provide in so many of the accounts around the world, and in Enoch, illicit knowledge, let alone agrarian knowledge, civilization knowledge, things like that. So they provide obviously knowledge that they were seemingly granted to provide, but then at a point they cross over and start providing illicit knowledge, as what Azazel provides in First Enoch, the art of war and to make weapons, and he introduces war to the antediluvian society. So knowledge can be good, but there's also evil knowledge and how you use that knowledge. So, and I think that's what happens at a certain point in time in the antediluvian world, and I think we see a similar effect again after the flood, but not to the same degree.
Well, what confuses me is, I got the weapon part and the war part. I understand that. But makeup and adornment, I realize that can lead to ego and stuff like that, but it doesn't have to. And the same thing about charms, spells, and medicine. I understand charms and spells, maybe, but medicine? And then, of course, knowledge. And I don't understand. I understand that anything can become a sin, but it doesn't have to. And why were these things? Why did these like I understand the weapons, but makeup and adornment, knowledge, medicine, homeopathy. There they didn't have science, but they did have a knowledge of herbs and things like that, and what can help you and make you feel better. Why was that a sin? I don't understand.
Well, not all of it was. It's how the information is used. It's neither good nor evil. It's how you apply it. So that's the big thing. Although when you do, that's why I sort of separated something like, the military aspect where you're creating war strategy and weapons and, and the slaughter that comes around that. That's a whole different sort of, idea, and it's, perverted going in. But, knowledge like medicine is good, but also, as we can see in today's world, and I think the antediluvian world advanced beyond where we are today based on, I think, the knowledge that these watchers provided and some of the things that we still see today that they built, which it would be a reflection of the high degree of knowledge, whether or not it's the pyramids or Machu Picchu or all of these antediluvian megalithic sites that we can't build today with that type of degree of accuracy, with that type of level of sacred geometry put in and celestial alignment, all suggests that they had a technology greater than what secular society would give them credit for. And just as we're told in so many of these other different, they had flying machines and all sorts of different things. And I think that they actually have, had a level of knowledge and technology beyond what we have today, but we're catching up so that we are moving into the days of Noah again as we move in towards the end time. So when we understand that we can do things with knowledge from our lens today, such as manipulate a DNA, for example, then you can start to do that with a very good sense, or you can start to corrupt the antediluvian world, which is what I think they did. And so we have lots of instances, whether or not it's the chimera or centaurs and on and on and on, of all of these fantastic beasts that are created in the antediluvian world, not recorded biblically, but recorded in other accounts around the world. And I think this comes a lot from the knowledge that they were developing. And when we look at that word corrupt in the Bible, that goes back to the word shakath, which means to totally destroy, to decay, to change. And I think that what they did was they changed the DNA and genomes in the plant life and the DNA in the animal life so much that the whole world came corrupt. And it's not an allegory of just the violence that was going on, but I think also literally the whole world was corrupted, just as what we're starting to do today. And so it's how that knowledge is applied. And you get the medical knowledge, and there's nothing wrong with medical knowledge in terms of creating health, helping people to live longer, to cure diseases. But when you start to cross a threshold at a certain point where you are now starting to change the DNA, you are trying to create gods on earth, creating clone beings, doing all sorts of different things that are, bound to lead to things that shouldn't be going on, then I think you're starting to use that knowledge of medicine even for evil. And again, I think we see that hinted at in the antediluvian world, and we certainly see that we're starting to do a similar thing. And again, the technology and the knowledge that we're developing, it leads you to a level where you can destroy your world. And I think they were hitting that same level of technology before the flood. And that's why God comes along, and in other accounts around the world, it's multiple gods who are going to have this world wiped out because they're led into the apocalypse by the offspring of the Watchers, the giants around the world, who are absolutely running a reign of tyranny, of war, and corruption of the world, and that the flood is designed to let the world start anew and have a second chance.
Okay, so God sent the flood, and Noah got the animals together, his family, but what I don't understand is God is perfect. But some of the giants, the children of the Watchers and the humans, survived. How did he screw up?
Well, God doesn't screw up. First of all, in terms of the animals that go on the ark, they're sent to Noah. Noah doesn't gather them up, and God sends them there because I think he knows which ones aren't corrupted, and that's the animals and the representatives of the species that he wants to start the world anew, free of this corruption.
But the giants
secondly, I would say, Secondly, I would say, God is Alpha Omega, and he sees everything from the beginning to the end. And even those who are going to be saved, because their names are written in the book of life from before creation. And it's up to us through free choice to keep our names in that book or have them erased. And so God is letting everything play out in free choice. Just as the angels were created immortal with intimate knowledge of God, they still had free choice to follow God or not. And as we've talked about previous, many of them rebelled, and they continued to rebel, and were trying to bring down humankind and ensure that humankind would not be raised above angels in the future of time by trying to destroy humankind and or just lead them away from God and justify, I think, their rebellion at the same time. So even in Eden, you have Adam and Eve who still have free choice. They only have one law that they can't break, and that's to eat of the knowledge of good and evil. And once they break that law, they're ostracized from Eden, and they're ostracized from the tree of life. And so they don't die instantly, but physically, without access, they're going to have a lifespan. And that spirit is not going to be able to go back to heaven, because there's a spirit, soul, and a body that's combined in our being, as the Bible teaches, unless there's a greater plan. Of course, God is Alpha Omega, and he is going to allow everything to play out through free choice because he's greater than free choice, and he sees what's going to happen when nobody else can see what happened. And so this is the first revenge of Satan. I think Genesis 6 is the second revenge by creating the Nephilim to do the same sort of thing, and that God has the Messiah plan to bring about through Adam's descendants as he picks 8 that are going to survive the flood and are going to bring about the Messiah. And the Messiah is going to bring about the resurrection, which permits the spirit to be able to go to heaven and be with heaven and intermingle with God, just as we worship in spirit. Whereas before and after the fall in Eden, the angels think they have at least got the upper hand and may have won on this. But if they had understood that God didn't tell them everything, they would not, as Corinthians talks about, permitted Jesus to be crucified if they knew about the resurrection. So moving back now to talking about the angels and their offspring, we have the impassioned angels, and this is before the flood, are going to be sent to the abyss. But as you mentioned, somehow angels either survive the flood or are recreated again after the flood. And again, you get a lot of accounts around the world where you have giants, whether it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Titian, who in his complete family, who are 2/3 God and 1/3 human, Nephilim, or Deucalion as the son of Prometheus, which is God, or Nephilim, which would be the son of a god as well by the same name, if that's the case. You have another Nephilim arc story along with Pyrrha, who is his wife, and you also have human accounts like the Noah story in the Bible surviving the flood. And I think these are separate accounts. So either they survived the flood that way, which I don't quite agree with, but I don't rule out because we're not told with a smoking gun verse in the Bible how giants survive the flood or show up after the flood. I think my conclusion is that the giants are recreated again after the flood by other impassioned angels who weren't in the abyss but would also be sent to the abyss for the same crime afterwards, and that's how they show up. And you get a distinction between the Nephilim, which are antediluvian, and the Rephaim, which are post-diluvian. So there's a distinction there, and I think there's two different creations that are going on and two different violations in terms of how they flood. But yet God permits that, just as God permits the angels who didn't totally violate the laws of creation and are totally evil, they weren't sent to the abyss. So we've got lots of fallen angels that are still out there and influencing the world, just as they would be ruling the 70 nations as they come out of the dispersion at Babel as the sons of Noah, which total 70, to rule those forming nations in the world, just as was done before the flood. And so this is all still being played out, and it's being permitted to play out so that the full numbers of the names written in the book, and as we would understand in Romans, the full numbers of the Gentiles after Jesus is resurrected are going to be fulfilled. And so there's a set time, and there's an ordained time for all of this to play out, so that mercifully as many as possible will choose to choose God, to choose Jesus, and to choose eternity.
So, are there now today watchers watching humanity?
Yeah, I would say yes on two accounts. I think you've got loyal watchers, like I would probably consider, even though we understand Michael as an archangel, these angels, that are around the throne, like the 7 angels talked about in Revelation 8, are, around the throne. And so I think Michael would be an archangel and likely a seraphim watcher. So you have the loyal ones, and then you have the rebellious ones. And we have both. So we have the loyal ones that are still helping, and Michael is the one who fights for Israel, right? He fights against the beast empires, just as we're told in John, where he's fighting Persia, or in the book of Daniel, where he's fighting Persia, and he's going to go next to fight Greece, which is the next beast empire, which is, again, part of this imagery that is also told to us in Revelations and are going to be part of the end time when the restrainer is removed, which makes a good argument for Michael as being the restrainer. But whoever he is, he's going to be removed, and then we are going to have the end time. And it's God who dictates when the restrainer is removed. And then you have the fallen angels that would also be seraphim watchers, and a whole bunch of other orders that are still influencing the world. And I still think guiding the world, because they're still in charge of the world and still governing the world, just as Satan, and they all report to Satan in the hierarchy, just as Satan is the god of this world for a little longer.
Okay. So it seems to me as though we are being influenced by etheric beings, and do we not have control or choice over anything? I mean, it just feels as though we're being led around in a massive game that we don't even understand what it is.
You're right. We do have a choice, but we're not given sort of the rules and the information in an easy manner, which is why I think for those who choose wisely, and whether or not people choose or don't choose, you've still made a choice, but whoever chooses to follow God will be rewarded by being raised higher than these spiritual beings in the future time. We're actually going to judge these angels for the sins that they've caused against us, as the Bible describes. And so I think that the choice is in this world that we're here to do is to figure out with little knowledge and to choose on faith, as opposed to what happened in the angelic rebellion, where they had all of the knowledge, but still chose to rebel. So I think that's what's going on. And in the meantime, with that choice going on, you've got these spiritual beings that I call angels, others call aliens, others call gods, are interacting with the world and leading us away from God. And you also have, as part of that, you have the demigods, who are the bodiless spirits or the demons of the original Nephilim, and you can make a good argument for Rephaim as well after the flood, that are working with the fallen angels and Satan to lead humankind astray through contact, through fear, through developing knowledge to discredit God, because everything that's done with the knowledge isn't done to honor the God of the universe. What is done in this world for the knowledge that is taught is to honor the pantheon of gods with megaliths, with temples, with images, with idolatry, and to discredit God for everything and not give him credit for anything, and to lead people away from God. So that's what the knowledge is seemingly designed to do. We see that with the seven, with the universities and the seven sciences today, where all of that, what I just said, is exactly what is going on. And anything that leads people away from God is a success for them. And so all of this is being influenced on us today by the demons, by the fallen angels, and by the descendants of the giants, who keep these genealogies that you were referring to earlier on in the show and track these genealogies all the way back. And they are working towards creating the new age, and this age where humankind would be reduced to almost, very few in number, just, as what you see coming out of the Georgia Guidestones, which is a Rosicrucian group made up of purebloods, at least from the 50% level and higher at the top level, and lower level ones at the bottom of the order, where they only want 500 million people. So humans only are there to serve this ruling class if they get their way, and to be used in rituals, and not always for, positive health in these kinds of rituals. I won't go into those, into the details on that, but understand that they don't have humankind's interests at heart. So this is the ruling class that has come down through history, and that's why they keep track of those genealogies, because the purer those bloodlines are, the higher that pedigree that you can take back to the giants, the Nephilim, the Azura, the Daitria, the Myosi, the heroes, the Anunnaki of the earth around the world. And they're all known by different names around the world, but they're talking about the same group of demigods and giants. These are the individuals who created the royal families and the ruling class and the nobility, which would be the outer sort of circles of that family that became the ruling class. And basically, the 1% that you hear of today would be what was going on back then, in terms of all being held by this ruling class. And this is the world that they want to create again going forward.
So if they had not fallen, if they had not decided to intermingle with humans, then there wouldn't have been a cause for the flood. What would have happened to humanity?
Correct.
I mean,
well, if there wasn't, if they didn't choose to intervene, certainly Satan then would not have, through using the Nakash in Eden, the serpent in Eden, you wouldn't have had the fall. And so things would have happened probably a lot more quickly, a lot more easily, and humankind would be in a different position where we are today. But unfortunately, through free choice, we created the longer scenario. The analogy is similar to what happened to Israel, where you have the Holy Covenant, and they have all of these blessings and promises, and including, the Messianic blessing, and all they have to do is follow the covenant. But of course, they continually rebel and violate the covenant, and so all is now being carried out not through the blessings of the covenant, but through the curses of the covenant, which are all outlined in the Bible in terms of, if you follow, this is what happens. If you don't, this is what happened. But also with a commitment that in the end time, he will remember his covenant and remember Israel and bring them back into the fold under the Messiah in the end time. So it all is all going to be played out. But you get these analogies of, if there wasn't any interference, what would have happened? I just think it would have happened a lot quicker.
Okay, because it seems to me that it wasn't, all right, we were created by God, yes, but we didn't choose all of this. It was his dominions that chose to screw around with humanity.
Well, yes, they did choose that as part of their rebellion and to try and make sure humankind, we're not going to be raised above them in the future time. Having said that, whether or not it's Adam or Eve or any individual and person after Adam and Eve, both before and after the flood, they had a choice to follow God or to follow the ways of the world, and the ways of the world are the ways of the rebellious angels. Everybody's had that choice all throughout the generations, and nobody's had a whole bunch more knowledge with humans than Adam and Eve, but they still rebelled. But they were all given this information, and I'll agree with you, it's stingy, but we're all given the information, and we're all here to figure out why we're here and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And, I respect people who might say, I go with the alien understanding of the world. I respect, people who say, I'm going to go with the polytheist side. I don't agree with them. But at least they've analyzed to a certain degree, asked critical questions, and they've made their choice. But even if you don't choose, even if you just go through this world and saying all of this is BS, you've still made a choice. So I would encourage people to really dig into this stuff and decide for yourself what you believe and what makes sense, because that's ultimately what we're here to do, and that's the free choice. Choose God. Or choose the other ways.
Wouldn't you think, though, that those watchers that have been thrown into the abyss until end times, wouldn't you think they've had enough time to sort of repent? I mean, it seems to me that they're going to be set loose to wreak ruin on humanity, and yet over the eons that they've been down there, wouldn't you think they would have had time to figure out that, if they chose the wrong side initially, and that maybe they should, choose the right side this time? If
they're permitted to repent. And the reason why I say that, and I don't even know whether or not some of them want to at this point or not. But what I do know is in Matthew it talks about, the abyss is reserved for these fallen angels, not the abyss, the lake of fire is reserved for these fallen angels, just as Satan is going to be sent to the abyss first, like the angels that are already there and will be released in the end time. And then Satan also will go after the millennium to the lake of fire where the angels of the abyss are sent. But what I do know is there is also information that we are provided that suggests that there is a point that you can cross where it's not going to be forgiven. And so I think that has something to do with the laws of creation and with the Holy Spirit, because we're told that the only thing that is not forgiven is blasphemies against the Holy Spirit, which is essentially providing the life for everything that's in the physical world. And this is the life that the fallen angels were manipulating, both through DNA and through creating these hybrid beings, hybrid human angels, and all these other hybrid beings in the antediluvian world, which we're starting to do on our own with our current technology. And so if I now link those two concepts up about sinning against the Holy Spirit and about creating or violating the laws of creation, as First Enoch likes to talk about, and this corruption that we're told about that corrupted the entire world, which the Holy Spirit provides life for, because the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, then match that up with what happens in the end time with those who take the mark of the beast and or worship Satan and his fallen angels in the last 3.5 years. Those ones of humans are not going to be provided the second death. So in Christianity, there's the first death, and then there's a resurrection for all of us, some into eternity and some to be judged that will go to the second death in the lake of fire, but not to be burned for eternity. But those who take the mark and worship Satan, it's both as it's qualified in the book of Revelation, will burn like the other angels in the lake of fire forever. So that suggests to me that whatever happens with this mark of the beast, it violates the laws of creation somehow and sins against the Holy Spirit, probably by changing our DNA or molecular makeup somehow, some way, similar to what happened with the creation of the demigod Nephilim, both before and after the flood.
Well, with all of the fallen angels that became the mythical heroes of old, you know, whether it's the Egyptian or the Norse or the Greek or the Roman, for the most part, they seemed, though they had egos and they had battles and they did stupid things, they seemed to be trying to help humanity.
Well, except that in all of those accounts, all of those gods in all of those accounts around the world brought on the flood to wipe out humankind.
Yes,
whereas in the Bible, it's authorized by God. Yeah. And besides from that, yeah. I mean, and what they, you know, and it's again, you get this sort of similar sort of story where you have this divine race that's created, and they are godlike and do good in the beginning according to the versions around the world, but at some point in time they start to become more narcissistic, hubris, corrupted by the world, and begin to do evil things and continue to increase in that evilness the longer that they live. And again, it's thought that these demigods were, you know, given very long life because they were created with the immortal spirit, which is talked about in Gnostic Gospels as the counterfeit spirit. And you get similar accounting in the book of Enoch, where this immortal spirit or the counterfeit spirit is passed on into a physical body where it doesn't belong. And that's where you're mixing spirit of heaven and flesh as that violation against the law of heaven. And that's why God steps in Genesis 6:3 to limit all life on the earth to 120 years, human and or hybrid human angel, which are the demigods. And so, you know, I think when you look at what these angels were doing, was they were there just to lead humankind away from God and to try and use these Nephilim, these giants around the world, as one of their chief tactical applications to usurp the kingships, what they did both before and after the flood, set up the Enochian mysticism, which is the same mysticism that shows up again after the flood and begins at Babel and is the source to all of the different polytheist religions around the world, and to make sure that they're being worshipped as opposed to the God of the universe, and that by doing so, they're leading people away from God. I think that's always the intent, and it's always what is going on, that every time they offer information or something, there is something attached that you may not see, but it leads to your destruction.
But God sends prophets to try to thwart it. I mean, Jesus for one, but there's also the Buddha. There have been other holy people that have been sent to sway humanity in the other direction. It's almost like he's playing part of the game. Well, that's not quite true. That's not quite accurate, as opposed to not quite true. What happens with whether or not, let's say, it's Buddha or with Maitreya, that they say is for the end time, or with Confucius, or with Hermes, or with all of these ones that are sent in that belief system, these are individuals who are sent to help humanity on their way to development into gods. And that's why they draft Jesus as a mortal prophet and an enlightened individual who is doing the same thing, as opposed to being the Word of God. Prophets in the Bible are there to help Israel and to warn them and to provide them what is going to happen if they continue to violate the laws of the covenant. And those prophets they disappear after not only, when Assyria is going to disperse Israel, and then you have Babylon
who was going to disperse Israel. These prophets essentially disappear after that, and they get reestablished. And only in the time of Jesus does it sort of reappear. So those prophets have not continued, and they will come back in the end time, as we're told that there will be people who will be prophesying. There will be the two witnesses. There will be the 144,000. But those did not continue, whereas in polytheism, you get this sort of steady stream of these enlightened people that are sent to help humankind, is the guys, and to provide more knowledge and to help them and humanity as a whole find their way or the path to Godhood. So kind of two different concepts.
Okay. But it does still feel as though there's manipulation going on. And, you do begin to wonder, what is the right direction to go? Yes, going to God. Got that. But in life, the choices that you make are also representative of the direction and the choices that you've made. So it's almost like with the Egyptians, after death, your heart is weighed against a feather. Is that going to happen to humanity as a whole? That at end times, we are going to be judged by our deeds and our philosophies and the way we have lived our lives, as opposed to something else?
Well, all will be judged. Some will be permitted on to eternity and some not. Now, for people of faith, they have their faith in God, the true God, and in Jesus. And they, by that resurrection, will be forgiven for the sins for their faith. For those who do not know about the true God or Jesus, and I would think in an intimate way, and I would think in an expanded way, although a lot of people will disagree with me on that, they will be evaluated based on what was in their heart. So what is in the spirit of what they're doing, and will be judged against that. And so I don't believe, based on what Romans is talking about on this, the book of Romans, that just because people have not heard about Jesus or were born before Jesus came, and people before the flood, just like Abraham, is going to be saved, and that was before Jesus came and was crucified and resurrected. I think there are some avenues for people who will actually be saved who aren't Christian, and I know that may not be popular amongst all Christians, but that's clearly what the book of Romans is talking about. And so I leave that judgment up to God, which God and Jesus are going to do, and also leave up to their wisdom as to who will be permitted into eternity and who isn't.
Oh, that makes sense. I think I find it fascinating that you are calling alien some of these watchers, as opposed to if they are alien, you're not saying they're from another planet or anything like that. You're saying that they are watchers that have taken on different forms. The watchers. No, I mean, they talk about the reptilians. They talk about, these other races of beings that are alien, are not terrestrial. Are you saying that the watchers are those beings?
Well, I think they are, and it's just a matter of how you're interpreting that set of individuals. And so when we talk about extraterrestrials or beings from another planet that call themselves watchers and are watching, as the alien mythos goes, the development of humanity and trying to help us not to destroy ourselves and they're the ones that are credited with providing the same knowledge and technology as the gods or the fallen angels are in the various religions around the world. It really is just a matter of how advanced these beings are in terms of your interpretation, what you want to call them. But I think they're the same beings. And again, we know, as we talked about earlier in the show, that they can take any shape or form that they want. And so I think they, and when we look at a seraphim angel, that's a reptilian being, right? And their offspring that they created look just like them. So when we look at the alien watchers, and it's also the Anunnaki that most of the alien sort of watcher beings sort of go back to, that we're hearing about, at least in the West, that are making the alleged contact with the governments, and I'm sure that that's going on, and advising them, and the same beings which are allegedly down in Antarctica. And again, I think that's probably true, but that's just my opinion. These are all the same beings. And so it's just a matter of, how far up that ladder you want to create them, right? But I do believe that they are from the spiritual realm, and that they have significant powers and significant knowledge, and are still trying to manipulate and guide humankind. So it doesn't surprise me that they use the same type of names in terms of their classification. And it wouldn't surprise me that they would have similar names, some of these ones. And it wouldn't surprise me that they would have other beings, because, again, even though these are shapeshifters, there's so many different kinds, whether or not there's the little gray alien ones or the reptilian ones that you're talking about. And, you sort of name or imagine the different varieties, and we get a hint of this in science fiction, because I think all of this information is handed down to prepare us for what they're going to show us in the end time, of all these different types of species allegedly that are around the earth. And again, I go back to what I had said earlier. I mean, all of these beings that were created after the flood doesn't mean that it stopped. I mean, before the flood doesn't mean it was, it stopped after the flood. And maybe they're not as visible and, kept a little bit more outside the world. So we have a lesser degree of that influence as to what was going on before the flood, or perhaps they survived the flood, whether or not they're the little, gray aliens as a fairy type creature out of the, out of the ugly ones, and mostly known as gnomes and things like that, the ones who looked after technology and knowledge and had flying machines and come through fairy portals and things like that. And the reptilians, whether or not some of the Cash survived, which is the serpent, or whether or not some offspring of the Nephilim survived as these reptilian type creatures. You've got two different avenues there that somehow they survived, whether it's in the earth or off the earth, or however that comes about. So I think we're either going to see those ones that either survived the flood or recreated again after the flood as part of this whole coming out of the alien welcoming committee to the galactic universe of species to fight against, guess who, the evil oppressive God of the Bible. And I think they're going to be saying, if you want to live in a separate realm like Satan had wanted to do, as described in Isaiah 14, then you're going to have to fight for this. And Earth is that sort of final battleground that if you want to live separate and away from the God of the Bible, you're going to have to fight for it. And that's going to come with, swearing allegiance to this rebellion in the end time, and to take the mark of the beast, and to make a stand. And again, what we see coming from all of these forces that are coming out of, occult secret societies and things, is they want to bring on the end time. They want this showdown. So again, we're still being manipulated by beings that seem to have done the same thing in the past as they've done all through history, and as to what they're coming as what they're doing now with what they're describing that they want to do. And I think they're accelerating our knowledge in the last, say, 30 or 40 years to bring us up to speed so that they're ready for this showdown in the end time. I think, again, it's like the days of Noah. And again, you have this knowledge that is being given to the antediluvians in the generation of Jared, or the sixth generation of the 10, according to the generations in the Bible of, of how many there were in the flood, that come out, in the last time frame of the antediluvian epoch, starting in the sixth generation. And I think that combines with the existing knowledge of the seven sciences and takes it to a whole new level, which is why you have such a rapid degradation of the world before the flood, and will ultimately be the cause of the flood, as overseen by the ruling class, which were the Nephilim back then.
Wow. Well, it does make a great deal of sense. I'm more comfortable with the the fact that there are other life forms here that really have been here forever, and it's not an invasion from outer space. That makes it a lot more comfortable for me, actually. So those groupings will become more and more obvious as the end times comes closer and closer. Is that what you're indicating?
Yeah, I think so, because until they're ready to provide the whole story, they need to sort of keep this image up. And the best way to explain these very powerful, highly developed, highly knowledgeable, advanced peoples is to call them just like us, only they're aliens and they've been around longer, right? That's the easiest way to sell that concept. But at a certain point in time, I mean, they're going to ask us to do battle, and we see this battle coming up, in Daniel and in Revelations, where you have this war in heaven, right? And we're going to see this going on, and so there. But also, if you have to understand that they want to sell to us that this opposing force isn't an all-powerful God. Powerful, yes, but that doesn't mean that you can't beat them, is the story that they're going to be selling.
Well, when you get down to there is already war here on the planet that we're very aware of, and it does feel as though it feels as though it's escalating, and it's going to be fascinating. I mean, end times is something that they've been predicting for a long time. So, are you saying that end times are closer than we thought?
Am I saying the end time is what? Is closer than we thought?
Yeah. I mean, my feeling was
I certainly am not.
No, go ahead.
I'm certainly not going to lay any dates on things, because that's a fatal mistake to do. But I think it's on the horizon, and and people, and even in my lifetime, people have been saying the end is now, the end is now. So we want to be very, very careful. Everything has to be in place before we can be in the end time. I think it's very possible that we're in the fig tree generation, and I think there's a good possibility that began either in 1947 to 48, when the nation-state of Israel comes about, or Jerusalem. And I would lean towards Jerusalem because, again, with the fig tree allegory, Jesus is the one who kills the fig tree in the New Testament, and also uses the fig tree as his analogy that when you see the fig tree blooming again, that this generation will not pass until all of these things that I have given you for the signs of the end time and my coming have been fulfilled. It'll all be fulfilled within that one generation. The question gets to be then, let's say, we're using 1967 for Israel taking Jerusalem, so that, there's an opportunity to set up sacrifice on the temple, which is, a huge obstacle in itself. But if you look at that as the starting point in one generation, then how long is a generation? Is it 70 years, as the Psalm talks about, or is it the 120 years that is talked about in Genesis 6:3? And if it's 70 years, well, then we're in a window here where, it could happen in the next 20 years. If it's longer than that, well, like the 120 years, I mean, there's a lot more things yet to happen. And although I think we're marching towards a universal religion, you see the World Council of Churches, you see more dialogue, you see a continual degradation of organized Christianity from within that I think is going to continue to go on, and so that until you get an environment where you can actually bring all of the religions together, but that's a big stumbling block. But if you do get that, then you'll get the permission of the Jewish people to start their sacrifice on a wing or an extremity of the temple. Extremity in the King James Version, wing is the definition of that, or on the outside of the temple, which is very difficult to see today with the Muslims still holding on to the mosque in Jerusalem. So I think it takes that universal church, and it takes that universal church and religion to bring about world government, which again, we're seeing that march towards world government, but it has been elusive because until we're in the exact time, it will not all come together. And those last major pieces will come together very, very quickly, whether or not it's through catastrophes, through wars, through contrived catastrophes. It'll take, I think, that kind of catalyst to drive people into the globalist arms and into the globalist religion that they're preparing to roll out, given the opportunity.
So the Watchers were then the stimulus for a lot of this, the beginning of it all.
In the beginning, yes. Yeah, I think, they were the leaders, right? And as you look at the hierarchy of angels, the seraphim are arguably at the top or second from the top. Okay,
so they started it out with coming together with humans, and are there now, I asked before if there were Watchers watching today, but are there Watchers in human form here today?
Well, I think so. I think there's angels, fallen angels in all sorts of forms here today, and I think there's fallen angels here in all sorts of forms. So fallen and loyal, they're still interacting with the world.
Well, they don't have driver's licenses, so how does one identify one? Is it? Well,
you would only know if they wanted you to know. But I think from a physical interaction, they don't want us to know, because I think their latitude was restricted significantly after the first flood, and I think they do interact in the world physically, but I think they interact more from a spiritual basis and as what you would call spiritual guides, or the celestial, white brotherhood, or the elder masters, and all the different names that there are for these individuals, and or aliens that secret societies and much of the the elite at the occult level communicate with, and self-admittedly communicate with. And also, I think they're communicating with some demons there, and I think that is sort of where a significant amount of the leading is being done. But I certainly would not suggest that they couldn't be here in another form. And maybe they can't choose all the different forms again because they could be more restricted. But when I look at descriptions of some of these beings after the flood that are in the Bible, like the satyrs, right? These are double goat gods, right? These are the same description as what you get for Azazel, or the Pan god, or Sunonos, or the Cern god, or Bacchus, and on and on and on, about this sort of seemingly more than one god. It could be the same, but it seems to be a class of degraded gods. So I think when we look at Azazel, also is depicted in that same sort of god class. I think these gods that may be on the earth are degraded from a seraphim status and perhaps other angelic status down to the satyr status after the flood for the rebellion and what happened to the antediluvian world. And when they did interact or do interact, they're in these sort of degraded forms from the former level of sort of, I guess, impressionable physical stature that they would have taken before the flood. Just my speculation.
I'm not asking for, written proof of all of this, but certainly your research is far more extensive than mine. But if there are the fallen watchers here, there have to be the unfallen angels. I don't know what to call them. Just angels, I guess. I know one of the terms I found for watchers were the awake ones. In other words, they had total understanding. So would the watchers that are here on the planet at this time, my feeling is that there are watchers here. There are people who are of an angelic nature here, but they aren't necessarily standing on platforms and preaching. They are in a more subtle form trying to impact humanity. That's just my feeling.
Yeah, and again, all things are possible. But I will say this: certainly in Daniel, we get an understanding that watchers are still interacting in the world, right? And that's in the time of Nebuchadnezzar when Daniel has, the watchers coming down and visiting. And so, and I think as we talked about, there are those rebellious watchers, and not all of them went to the abyss. So I think they would be, still interacting. So I would also enter into the discussion that just as Satan masquerades or disguises him as an angel of light, so do his followers, which include, the rebellious angels. And so everybody is trying to work from a position of light and a position of good. The trouble is that not all of them are truthful, and that's for us to try and discern, as difficult as that can be when they're projecting, this projection of goodness and projection of love and for the betterment of humankind. You still have to discern, whether or not they're following the true God of the universe from a Christian perspective, or they're part of the rebellious ones. And you can discern that by asking them.
Well, that's easy. So what is the purpose for the watchers in end times? Now you have the fallen ones, but you have watchers that have not fallen. So will there be a separate battle in heaven, or is it all going to take place here on earth?
Well, we're going to see it in the skies, I think. And what you're going to see is the rebellious ones are going to try and overtake heaven, but they're all going to be expelled as what is described in Revelation 12, down to the earth at the 3.5-year point of the last 7 years. And so we're going to see that. So we're going to see that great battle. And it will be perceived as one battle, and that they're going to need, because of that one battle where they're all down here, they're going to actually probably turn that into, we're here to help you win this war against the oppressive ones. And so that is going to lead into Armageddon at in the end time. So yeah, I think we're going to see war in heaven, and it's going to be sold to us as a sort of extraterrestrial battle, just as in Star Wars. And again, Star Wars is a great analogy for what the end time is going to look like.
Is that similar to what in the Indian their vimanas and their flying ships? Is that a similar type of battle that was going on at that time?
I think so, and I think they had weapons that were so powerful that could destroy the world. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very much open to the interpretation and understanding that you could translate from Hebrew, Genesis book 1, in particularly Genesis 1 to 2, that this is where the earth became void and formless, as opposed to, was created form and voidless. And I got a great step-by-step document for people if they want to get a hold of me through my website. I'll send that to you in terms of how you could translate that easily as we understand it in current doctrine, or that the world became void and formless. And I think that time frame before the earth is recreated, as Psalms 104:30 talks about, when God sends the Spirit, the earth is renewed. And in Genesis, chapter 1, verse 2, we see the Spirit hovering over the earth. I think this is the renewal of the earth. My preferred, not doctrinal for me, but I think you can make an absolutely awesome argument for the world being destroyed because of this angelic war, and is a better place for the timing of the angelic rebellion than, immediately after the creation of the earth and the creation of humankind, because there's such a short time frame there. And so I think when you look at that world that might have been before the second creation of earth, and before it's just the first one is destroyed in the angelic war with these fantastic weapons that we see in the Vedas and in other religions about that war, is you have these seraphim angels that we talked about, who are these serpent-faced angels who are feathered and have these wings and are a flying dragon, a reptilian type of being, right? And imagine Quetzalcoatl and the feathered or plumed serpent. Now what we're learning is that dinosaurs had feathers. And, of course, they're reptilians. And dinosaurs, before that name was invented, say, about 300 years ago, rough and dirty, they were called dragons before, because they're part of the same sort of understanding of those kind of beings. And that would have been, to me, a favored type of being for reptilian seraphim watchers in the first world, and again, created giants. So sort of accounts for some of the aging that science is telling us about in terms of how old these creatures actually are. I'm fine if that's before or after, day 6, but I just think the whole thing fits better with a previous earth that's destroyed in the rebellion, and then the earth is renewed and made afresh, and humankind is created again, this time with a destiny to be raised above these rebellious angels through faith, and in doing so convicts these rebellious angels. And that's why Satan, right out of the gate, is going to bring down the downfall of Adam and Eve to try and prevent that from happening. It just seems to me fits better. Again, not doctrinal on that, but I just think it just fits better.
Well, going by the premise that the earth has been here millions and millions of years, and that there have been startovers all over the place, at least 5 mass destruction, and we're not even talking biblically, we're just talking scientifically here for the moment. Is this a pattern that when we come to end times, that once there is that massive destruction, and then there's supposed to be 1,000 years of peace, I understand that, but is this something that has been that has happened before and will happen again?
Mm-hmm. As on earth, or as in heaven, as on earth. That's kind of that hermetic sort of saying, or nothing new under the sun is what we're told in the Bible. And so what is going on with the end time is just kind of a repeat of the angelic rebellion, what happened before the flood, what happened at Babel, and a few more times as we go throughout history. And even in the end time, you're going to have Antichrist in the book of Daniel try and raise his throne into heaven and be like God, just as El, the Hebrew word that's used for the Italian word Lucifer in the King James Version Bible, tried to raise his throne above not only the earth, but into heaven and above God, to be worshipped like God, to have a realm like God in Isaiah 14. And so nothing new is under the sun. You see the same thing that was happening, I think, in the antediluvian world with the Nephilim monarchies and demigods that were ruling is they were actually, in the polytheist accounts, warring against the gods. And again, I think that's just from a Christian perspective, that's a polytheist parallel story of rebelling against God and his loyal angels. And they were trying to raise their thrones into heaven as well. And then again at Babel, you have Nimrod come along, building Babel City and Babel Tower, and having a sway like Antichrist with a universal Babylon religion, who is trying to raise his throne into heaven. And with the knowledge that they have found, which is found by Hermes, according to secret societies, and Albert Mackey out of Freemasonry in particular, who had recorded, a significant amount of the Polychronicon in that book in terms of the legends, talks about Hermes finding the knowledge before the flood that was created by Enoch and is buried under the pyramids, and brings that back to Babel and to Nimrod, and they start with that knowledge is they start to build the city, start to build the tower, and re-implement the Enochian religion of the antediluvian world. And so again, it's another analogy of what was going on in the angelic rebellion. Just again, as we'll see that with Antichrist doing the same thing. So yes, it is the same thing being played out over and over and over on earth as what happened in heaven. Nothing is new under the sun. And I think that's why we're told in Matthew 24, Jesus clearly says it will be like the days of Noah. And we need to learn everything about what happened in the days of Noah, understanding that Noah lived 600 years before the flood and then 350 years after the flood, which would have included Babel and the recreation of the giants after the flood.
So if we destroy the earth, literally, well, no, I don't think we will blow it up, but if the surface is wiped clean, will this whole process start again?
Well, we're not told that it would start again, but we're also not told biblically that that will happen. So except for Jesus stepping in to prevent it from happening, the destruction of the entire world, it would be destroyed. But Jesus steps in and he shortens those days, otherwise everything would be destroyed. And in the end time, we get three different levels of destruction that are going to go on that come with the seal judgments, with the trumpet judgments, and with the bowl judgments. And the bowl judgments happen in the last 3.5 years. The trumpets certainly within the first 3.5, and I would look at most of the seal judgments early in the first half, but could start before the last 7 years as well. And if you look at that, you get 25% of the earth being destroyed, and in terms of numbers of people, and within that series of destructions and judgments, you get wormwood, which a lot of people think in the alien mythos is that planet Nibiru, which is bringing in these Anunnaki on a planet that's coming in somehow from a very long orbit again and back into, I guess, travel distance to get to us today. I don't follow that line of thought, but that's part of the alien mythos that's sort of walking a parallel kind of dance to what's being talked about in Revelation. And then you have the trumpet judgments, which destroys 33% of the population and everything on the earth. And the bowl judgments would destroy everything if Jesus weren't to step in and come back and prevent that from happening. And these judgments aren't sent from God in destroying the world. These judgments that are being permitted are done by the people of the earth and the people leading them in the end time. So it's all self-inflicted. This isn't, as a lot of people will teach, that God is throwing down these horrible judgments. These are all brought on and caused by humankind. And this apocalypse is by fire, whereas the first one was by water. And so when Luke talks about the days of Noah, he will also talk about Sodom, which I think is the location for the second incursion. And he links the days of Noah and the days of Sodom to the end time, whereas Mark and Matthew only use the days of Noah. Again, that's not a contradiction. That's additional information Luke is providing, because Sodom is destroyed by fire, and in the end time, the earth is destroyed by fire, as opposed to before the flood, it's destroyed by the flood with water. So apocalypse by water, then apocalypse by fire. And the apocalypse by fire is all similar to the other accounts in other religions around the world. As we move into the next age, this earth is going to be destroyed by fire, which sort of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Barbara, when there's been many disasters or earth destructions recorded in polytheism. And, you know, the next one that's coming in that celestial procession is, as it's seemingly it's linked to celestial procession in these religions, which is the age of Aquarius, as we know that in a westernization of the polytheism. And that too, as with all the other religions, it's a destruction by fire. Now, we don't know when in the age of Aquarius that's going to happen, because one of those ages is like 2,200 and some odd years. So it certainly didn't happen in 2012 like the predictors were saying. That was just the start of the age, right? So there's a wide area in there where that destruction by fire could come, I guess is my point.
So what did, now I'm going from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but what did Jesus have to say about this? I mean, did he talk of end times?
You're asking if Jesus talked about the end times?
Yeah.
Was that the question? Yeah, he does, and it's because it's brought up by the disciples, and it's one long sort of oration. Oration. There is, a couple other references, like I mentioned earlier, with the angels going to the lake of fire. But essentially, and there's a few parables with the separation of the tares and the weeds. But essentially, you get most of that information in Matthew 24, and Jesus lays out the chronology and the major events. And my advice for people is, if they want to understand Revelation, you need to read Matthew 24. Mark's version is pretty much 100% identical. Luke will add a few more details. So I would overlay that as additional information on the Matthew account, and that will match up as a terrific overlay over to Revelation. So you'll understand then that Jesus' oration there is linear, from the beginning right through to the end, and he lays out the markers and the timing. And if you overlay that on to Revelation, you can better understand how those prophecies in Revelation are going to lay out. It's my thought that you put all prophecy around what Jesus said, not vice versa, because Jesus is the spirit of prophecy and the author of everything written in the Bible. So go to the authority first, and it'll lay it all out. You have two halves, two tribulations. It tells you when the major events are going to happen, and lay that down. And particularly picking up on one significant thing that Jesus says is that it's like birth pains for the end time. And so as you get closer to the end time, the pains get stronger and shorter in coming, just as what happens with end time events. So whether or not you have a disaster of war or hurricanes or whatever, they're going to increase and come more often. And you also apply that, in terms of my approach to prophecy, is to the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl wrath judgments. And again, because if you apply the birth pang metaphor that's described in the Old Testament, and all of the allegories are described in the Bible, you just got to go back and find the meaning, and then overlay that onto prophecy, you'll get a clear understanding of Revelation being linear. And then you'll be able to match up all the other prophecies by matching that chronology up. So it makes just understanding prophecy so much easier, because it's a big subject. I mean, over a third of the book of the Bible is prophecy, and trying to make sense of all the different prophets and their end time prophecies, and trying to sort which ones were happening during the time of the prophet or shortly thereafter, and an end time prophecy, you have to understand what the markers are and how that lines up with what Jesus said. He's the key to understanding all of that.
Well, I mean, end times have been prophesied since the beginning of time. I mean, the end is coming. The man on at Times Square has had that billboard on his chest for my entire lifetime, saying the end is coming, and the end is coming. It's a matter of when.
When?
So
yep. We just don't, and we don't know when, and that's why we always have to be careful. and a good analogy is that, I mean, look how long Israel anticipated, and then Judah, because the northern kingdom was lost into the nations of the earth until the end time, were anticipating when and who their Messiah would be. And they waited seemingly forever, and they were anticipating him so hard that they didn't recognize him when he came. And he didn't come in the way that they wanted him to come. That's analogous for the end time.
Yeah, they wanted a warrior with an army, and they got a peacemaker.
Yeah. But that's because they only were looking at the prophecies that they had from the lens that they wanted to see him in, as opposed to all of the prophecies. And had they looked at all of the prophecies about him, they would have said, wait a minute, there's another half here. How does that play in? And when I talk to people about prophecy, I try and make that point, is that you need to include all of the prophecies on a particular subject, and they all have to fit. You can't just take the ones that fit your contrived or preconceived conclusion. You need to put them all together and lay that down in the chronology alongside with what Jesus said, and then let it tell its story. If you do that, I think you're going to be fine. And what you won't do is get caught up falsely predicting when the rapture is going to happen, like we had with that astrology sign of the red dragon in the sky with an astronomical alignment, which is really an astrology interpretation for the sign of Revelation 12. And somehow the sign of Revelation 12 a couple of years ago was going to be when the rapture happens. And it's like, I'm telling everybody, no, don't get trapped that way, because A, astrology would never be used. And secondly, you just can't jump to the midpoint of the last 7 years without having all these other things come together and happen first. You just can't get there. And Revelation 12 isn't the rapture sign. That is the Exodus sign for Judah and lost Israel. That's got nothing to do with the rapture. So you have to be careful. Not that I don't think that Jesus doesn't come at about the same time for rapture, and then second Exodus, and then for Armageddon, and what Luke calls the days of Jesus' coming that people are going to wish for. But understand that they're different events of the end time. And that we got to have world government, and we have to have universal religion, and you have to have the sacrifice going on a wing of the temple for the first 3.5 years before you can get to Revelation 12, which is the war in heaven, and the abomination when Judah flees to the wilderness, right?
Yeah, you've used the term twice now that I really want to. I keep saying, ask him about that when he takes a breath. You're talking a sacrifice, and when you go back to Judaism, it was a goat or a lamb or a dove or a chicken or whatever. What kind of sacrifice are you talking about? Because, of course, the one that comes to mind is human sacrifice, and I can't believe that a human sacrifice would be used. So what kind of sacrifice is indicated?
Well, so what they'll do several kinds. None of them will be human. At least I would hope not. But sticking to Judaic law and to the holy feasts of the covenant, they would do sacrifices, and many different sacrifices on different feast days, whether it's the Day of Atonement or Passover or the Feast of Trumpets and all the various feasts and Sabbaths throughout the year. Those are typically either atonement sacrifices for atoning sin and for other things in terms of the worship of God, but typically they're going to be goats, lambs, and sometimes some bulls.
That I understand sacrifice, but when it comes to a blood sacrifice, it's just me. I could sacrifice candy, or I could sacrifice money or wealth, or I could become a vegetarian. I mean, does the term sacrifice in that context infer it has to be a blood sacrifice?
For certain things, it has to be a blood sacrifice, and I think Daniel is very clear that the sacrifices that were going on in the temple before is what is going to be happening in the first 3.5 years. So it's going to be a blood sacrifice, I think, and just throw in something interesting, because we're talking about the Watchers tonight, is that there are 2 goats on the Day of Atonement that are sacrificed. And the second goat is the one that is sent into the wilderness to die. And this is called the scapegoat. Yeah. And scapegoat, which is in the King James Version Bible, goes back to the Hebrew Azazel. Now, what's interesting about that is that we talked earlier that Azazel was the leader of the Watchers who reported directly to Satan, and he's the one who's called the host of the Watchers that goes to the abyss along with his followers for creating the giants before the flood and the other sins that they did. And also in First Enoch, he is described as the one who is ascribed all sin for providing the type of knowledge or leading the Watchers to give the knowledge. And certainly in Enoch it talks about other angels providing knowledge. But he's the one who is ascribed all sin, and that is a scapegoat. And so that scapegoat that is called Azazel, I do not believe is coincidental. And I think what they're sacrificing on the Day of Atonement is that special sacrifice for the sins of Azazel in the antediluvian world. Who knows? We may even see that part of the sacrifice in the first 3.5 years. And it may be described as Azazel in the first 3.5 years, because that's the Hebrew word for scapegoat. And what's interesting about that is Azazel, I think, is Abaddon and Apollyon, who is in the abyss. And he's the king of the abyss. And I think this is the one who comes out of the abyss and is one who overthrows the 2 witnesses and kills them temporarily, and then they're resurrected at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And he is also the one that's described in relationship with Antichrist, who is called son of perdition, because Antichrist is the one who once was, now is not, but will be again, and is the 8th king of the 7th as he takes over the end-time empire at the 3.5-year point, crowned by the abomination in the abyss in the temple, which we've talked about a few minutes ago. And he is the one that comes up out of the abyss, which is Abaddon Apollyon, that I'm asserting is Azazel. Now, where that starts to connect is that perdition goes back to a set of Greek words that includes Apollyon. and Apollyon means destroyer, as does Abaddon in Hebrew. And so I think Azazel, Abaddon, Apollyon is the one who avatars Antichrist and gives him the additional power in the end time to do the great miracles and things that he does to convince the world that he's Messiah. And that happens after he receives the fatal head wound in Revelation 13, and he falsifies the resurrection, just as he will have a counterfeit Armageddon to bring in peace on that he's crowned on in the Temple of Jerusalem at the 3.5-year point. He's also the one who negotiates the last 7 years, but these are two different stories that I'm talking about in terms of his ascent and when he's crowned and when he's avatared by Azazel, Abaddon. And I take my biblical application for that avatar effect is because Satan enters Judas to help him over the hump to betray Jesus, just as I think Satan also enters into the Nakash in Eden to deceive Eden, and he isn't the actual one because Satan doesn't lose his arms and legs and wings and his voice and his intelligence and doesn't crawl on the ground. It's the Nakash being that does. So there's a biblical case in terms of connecting how Abaddon, Apollyon, Azazel is the one who comes up with the abyss and is the Antichrist. And now, if I take that back to the Old Testament, the God of fortresses that Antichrist will honor as he's rising to power and fighting his battles goes back to the Hebrew word maus, which is rooted in a whole series of words again that includes a word az, which means fortresses, strong, mighty, powerful. And you put el on azaz, and that goes back to Azazel. And that is also part of a set of root words that goes back meaning to goat and goes back to the scapegoat that's used in the Day of Atonement that I talked about, where you get the actual word Azazel. So those whole series of words sort of come in and emanate and flow together and to come out of it to get a greater meaning. And we also understand it is Antichrist who is going to destroy Babylon in Revelation 17. So after the midpoint of the last 7 years, he sets up his own religion, and I think this is the God of forces that he's going to honor. And when you look at Jeremiah 51, you have this destroyer that is going to destroy Babylon, and you take that word back to destroyer in verses, I think, 47 to 51 in chapter 51, and that word destroy goes back to the word abad and is the root word for Abaddon. So I think all of the meanings of the Hebrew and the Greek words, as you take that back to the original language, gives you a fuller meaning, and that Azazel, the scapegoat and the sacrifice that probably will be made on a wing of the temple, is the God that is going to, I think, possess or avatar Antichrist in the end time after he receives the fatal head wound. I know that was a bit of an impassioned rant, but I just thought, you know what, we're talking about watchers. Let's talk a little bit more about Azazel.
So he could be the sacrifice, but you can't kill an angel.
Oh, you know, you're not going to sacrifice him. They'll be sacrificing to him as part of that pantheon of gods.
I hear what you're saying. It's just hard to grasp that in these days, a sacrifice of an animal will be enough to appease God or to set things in motion.
Well, not to appease God. I mean, that's got nothing. I mean,
well, to fill
don't
to
confuse.
fill the
Don't
to fill the prophecy.
Yeah, but you're confused. Yes, but don't conflate two different issues here. So, I mean, they still do a sacrifice of. I guess they don't really do it today, but they will in the last 3.5 years to do that sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. And Azazel is that second goat that they used to do back when they're still in the land of the covenant. I think that comes back in the end time. But maybe I wasn't as clear as a separation on this. I think when Antichrist comes to power, they'll be doing sacrifices to Azazel that is separate from what I was talking about, what the people of Israel will be doing in the first 3.5 years. And
gotcha.
Antichrist comes to full power at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So after Judah has fled the temple and the land of the covenant, then a different sacrifice comes in that will be sacrifices made in honor of Azazel.
What you're saying, I understand. I'm having trouble grasping it, but I understand what you're saying.
That's what makes prophecy sometimes difficult to say, is all of that true, right? Because it's talking about things that you just like, how does that relate in our world? Or when they're talking about some of these creatures in Revelation 9 that are going to be in this war, right? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. But I would also suggest two things when you get into when you get into what's going to happen in time. Things are going to change so quickly and so fast. We just want to be careful we're not caught off guard by how amazed that we are at some of the awful things that we're going to be seeing, because even the elect are going to be deceived if that were possible and caught off guard. And I also look at the advancement of technology going down a different angle of trying to understand and believe that these things likely are going to happen, is as we're doing all of this DNA manipulation and technological advancement and marrying up into AI, intelligence of things, I could imagine a biological weapon that is part animal, part whatever, AI, military weapon that it could be created to fight wars in the not too distant future, which could be describing what we're seeing in the Revelation 9 war. That's 200 million. And I also think that's the fake Armageddon, by the way. That's not Armageddon. That's the one that Antichrist is going to rise to power on as taking credit for defeating this great army, and then will say, I am going to bring in peace, just as what Jesus does at Armageddon. So it has to be this war that everybody thinks is Armageddon. So it has to be, of such a significant level. And this is 200 million people. And that relates to, the Revelation 9 war relates to the same type of descriptions of a war in Joel 1 and 2, which is not the Armageddon war. The Armageddon war in Joel comes in verses 3 and 4. So this happens before, and those creatures are eerily identical. And the other war that we're told about in the Old Testament, which is the Gog war, which is such an interesting name, Gog and Magog, and this alliance of nations that are going to invade Israel, somewhere towards the 3.5-year point, is the one that I think Antichrist takes credit for as he's rising to power and part of whatever part of the empire of the world that he's part of, and I think probably Europe, is going to defend Israel, because that's part of that Daniel 9:27 peace treaty covenant, where he guarantees in negotiating that covenant for the universal religion who sponsors it, Israel's peace and safety, and that he's obligated to stop these nations from destroying Israel from the face of the earth. So whether or not he's the one who saves it, I don't think so, because clearly in the Bible it says God steps in and fights for his people in that day. And we know the Gog war is an end-time war because it says so. It's a last-day war in Ezekiel 38, and in Ezekiel 39, which is the second part to that war, same war, just more details of the prophecy, is talking about second Exodus, which I also place in the last 7 years, and the war happens before second Exodus. And I also look at that word Gog. And Gog is a name of a giant in Greek mythology who is the son of Iapetus, as is Magog, which is the other name, and with some other giant names that they created as well. And I wonder whether or not these are part of the either
demon spirits of the Nephilim or angels named God that they named their offspring after, possibly, that are leading this war as well. So I think there's a double entendre of meanings going on as to the nations and as to who's actually leading them, because I don't believe Gog and Magog names are there, just as a coincidental name.
No, I agree with you. And, it feels like, too, that the giants are coming back. So that'll be interesting.
Well, I would, as I read in my book, I wouldn't take that out of the picture by any stretch of the imagination, because it's going to be like the days of Noah. I think there's going to be two avenues to that. I think you have the descendants of the giants, who are the ruling power and the royal families. And then I also think there's a good possibility that we're going to either have bodies created through cloning, robots, whatever you want to call it, that are going to house as a dwelling place an oikotarian for these demon spirits, so that they can interact in this world. And that's part of how knowledge can be misused. Or there's going to be another recreation of giants, either through DNA manipulation or, again, physical copulation. And I think we get a hint of that in Daniel 2:43, because in Daniel 2:43, you have the description of these metallic empires that are part of the allegories to describing the empire's past and the end-time empire, just as described in Revelation 13 and 17. They're the same empires, including the end-time empire. And out of these metallic empires and or beast empires, you have this strange verse in Daniel 2:43 in the King James Version Bible, where it says the descendants out of these metallic empires are going to mix their seed with humans. And that is a very strange thing to say. And when you take that back to Hebrew, you find out that, again, that's sort of adding up and defining that there's two different sort of beings or species. And so that I think when you have the 10 toes that's described in that prophecy on two different legs, you have two different entities. You have probably either diluted bloodlines and or human strongmen and some kind of physical Nephilim or descendant of the Nephilim that are intermixing their seed with humankind. And I think that is, even though I think the bloodlines are going to be part of the ruling class and part of the nation, I think there's going to be likely some sort of re-emergence of real Nephilim that are part of the leaders of the end-time empire. Just seems to me makes more sense.
Yeah, it does to me too. And our clock is clicking down like crazy here. I do want to remind people that the name of your book is Genesis 6, and it is an amazing book. I have actually read it twice, and it's worth 2 or 3 readings, because you can never get it all at the same time. Are there any other websites or whatever that you want to get out there before the Blog Talk shuts me down?
Sure. If you want some information on giants or the Antediluvian epoch, get a hold of me through my website, genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6. Just give me the general area that you're talking about. I've got lots of documents. I can send that to you. You can also get a hold of my book through that website and link over to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or Kindle if you're interested in that version. And you also get a signed copy from me. You can get a hold of me through that website because there's an email there. You can contact me through Facebook under Gary Wayne. And if you ask me a question either way or ask for a document, I will get back to you. And you can do the same on Twitter under @GaryWayne63, @GaryWayne63. And I put out a very interesting, I think, commentary about every week to week and a half. I put out one on the 70 gods, if you're interested in that one, last week. I put out one on the serpent imagery and gods, a 2-part series on that, and their offspring, the the giant Nephilim that look just like them in the weeks before that. So if you're wanting anything on giant wars or anything like that, get a hold of me. I probably have a document on it, and I will send it to you.
Fantastic. I want to thank you so much again for an evening that I will have to listen to the archive on over and over again, too. I so appreciate your coming back and sharing your wisdom with us, and hopefully I can get you back yet again.
I would love to come back, and I can't believe how 2 hours flew by this quickly, but we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully we answered a few questions, and I'm sure it just raised more questions, but that's why we need to talk about this, so that people have a better understanding as to what happened, because I think it's important to understanding what's going to happen.
Absolutely. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I so totally appreciate it. This will be up in archive. If you enjoy it, please subscribe. Good night now.